I signed up to be a park ranger thinking it would be all peaceful days, wandering trails, helping lost hikers, just soaking in nature. But this forest, this place was something else entirely. It wasn't on any official map, and its name, forget about it, didn't show up anywhere. Not even in some joke book. When the job offer came through, the instructions were crystal clear. Don't talk about the forest to outsiders. Don't ask questions. And above all else, follow the rules. Right from the start, things felt off. This forest wasn't natural. The trees were way too tall, their trunks all twisted and black, like they'd been through a fire but never actually burned down. And the wildlife. Don't even get me started. Some of the animals had eyes that glowed in the dark, and their calls sometimes they sounded almost human. Creepy, right? My first day, my supervisor introduced me to this businessman from Ashen Blade Industries, Mr. Thorne. He handed me a laminated card with the rules printed on it. This weird smile plastered on his face. The ink on the card looked brand new, like they were rewriting these rules all the time. You break the rules, Thorne said, all serious. You won't last the night. Understand? I nodded, but honestly, I didn't get it. Not then. The card had 8 rules, plain and simple. Rule 1. Stay on the marked trails between sunset and sunrise. Straying even a single step into the brush after dark is basically a death wish. Rule 2. If you hear a kid crying, ignore it. Seriously, do not approach, don't try to be a hero. Cover your ears and just keep moving. Rule 3. If the forest suddenly goes silent, find a tree with carvings on it. Stand right under it and wait for the sounds to come back. And whatever you do, don't look up. Rule 4. Stay away from the northern ridge after dark. Something hangs out in the tree line up there, and it really doesn't like being watched. Rule 5. If you see a deer with antlers that spiral like corkscrews, don't make eye contact. And if it starts following you, run like hell. Rule 6. The lake in the middle of the forest is safe enough during the day. But after dark, stay at least 50 feet from the shoreline. No exceptions. Rule 7. If you hear your name whispered, don't answer. It's not who you think it is. Rule 8. Lights in the trees. Turn around and get out of there, fast. They're definitely not fireflies. At first, I thought the rules were some kind of joke, a way to mess with the new guy. But there was something about the forest itself that made me uneasy from day one. The trees were massive, towering over everything, their branches all gnarled and twisted, reaching up like claws. The trails were covered in mossy rocks, and some of the trees had these weird carvings on them, symbols I couldn't even recognize. During the day, it was quiet, too quiet. No birds singing, no buzzing insects, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. But when dusk started to settle, the air got colder, and the shadows stretched way out. I made sure to stick to the trail, just like Rule 1 said. Then one night, around 9 p.m., the forest went dead silent. I froze in my tracks, heart pounding. My own breathing sounded crazy loud in the sudden stillness. Rule 3 flashed in my mind: find a carved tree, stand under it, don't look up. I scanned the trees, freaking out a little, and spotted one of the marked trunks, maybe 20 feet away. The carvings there looked ancient, deeper, almost glowing in the dark. I backed up against the tree, gripped my flashlight tight, and just waited. The silence dragged on forever. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on leaves. My jaw clenched. Don't look up, don't look up. The footsteps got louder, closer, until they stopped right behind me. My breath hitched. I could feel something there, looming over me, heavy and suffocating. The air around me turned ice cold, and I heard a faint rustle of fabric, like someone shifting their weight. Then, slowly, The forest sounds came back. Birds chirped in the distance, the wind rustled the leaves again. Whatever had been there was gone. I didn't move until my shift ended at dawn. The second night started quiet enough. I stuck to the trails, keeping my flashlight beam low. Around midnight, I saw something moving through the trees ahead. At first, I thought it was another hiker, a figure with long limbs, moving all jerky and uneven. "Hello," I called out, breaking protocol. My voice echoed in the forest, but the figure didn't answer. I stepped closer, shining my light on it. It stopped moving, head tilting to the side in this unnatural way. And then, BAM! The forest went completely dark. My flashlight died, just flickered out. And these faint green lights started popping up in the treetops. At first, they looked like fireflies, small orbs of light drifting between the branches. But as they got closer, I realized they weren't fireflies at all. These lights didn't flicker, they pulsed like tiny beating hearts. And they weren't random, they were coming right at me. I turned and ran, branches whipping at my face and arms as I sprinted down the trail. The lights followed, their glow getting brighter, closer. By the time I reached the ranger station, my legs were burning, lungs about to explode. I slammed the door shut, locked it tight. The lights hovered just outside the windows, their pulsing glow like a warning in the darkness. Every night in that forest was worse than the last. The rules kept me alive, sure, but they didn't make me feel safe. Something was out there, watching me, lurking just off the trails, waiting for me to mess up. I started seeing patterns. The same symbols carved into the trees kept showing up near the areas where the rules were the strictest. The northern ridge, especially, seemed to hum with this weird energy, like the forest itself was alive. Then one night, I found a scrap of paper tucked in the desk drawer at the station. It wasn't part of the laminated rules, but it was written in the same handwriting. It said, "The rules aren't just to keep you safe, they're to keep it contained." I didn't know what was, but every time I stepped into that forest, I felt like I was one wrong move away from finding out. The third night kicked off, just like the others, quiet, cold, and seriously tense. I kept my flashlight beam low as I walked the marked trails, just repeating the rules in my head over and over. By then, they were burned into my brain, each one feeling like a lifeline in this weird, hostile place. It was a little after 1 a.m. when I heard it, a kid crying. The sound was faint at first, carried on the wind, like some distant echo. But as I walked further down the trail, it got louder, more clear. This high-pitched wail, just full of desperation and fear. I froze solid. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and run. Then Rule 2 popped into my head. If you hear a child crying, do not approach, do not try to help. Cover your ears and keep walking. But the crying didn't feel distant anymore. It was so close I could almost hear the ragged breaths between the sobs. "Help me," the voice called, breaking into this heart-wrenching sob. My fists clenched up tight. I forced my feet to keep moving, heart hammering in my chest. I jammed my hands over my ears, staring straight ahead. "Please," the voice wailed, "don't leave me." It was unbearable. Every step I took felt like some kind of betrayal. I'd spent years as a ranger protecting people, guiding lost hikers to safety. Ignoring this cry felt wrong, inhuman, even. But I kept walking. The crying went on, getting more frantic. "Don't go," it screamed, the voice cracking with desperation. "Please, it's coming for me." And that's when my resolve just crumbled. I stopped. My hands slipped from my ears as the sobs turned into this faint, pitiful whimper. Against every rule, every instinct for self-preservation, I turned around. The trail behind me was empty. No kid, no footprints in the dirt. Just the faint green glow of the forest and those towering, twisted trees. For a second, I thought maybe the voice had stopped. Then I heard it again. Softer now, but closer. "Help me," it whispered. The sound was coming from the brush, just off the trail. My flashlight beam flickered as I stepped closer, scanning the undergrowth. "Hello," I called out, voice shaking. Something moved in the bushes, rustling the leaves, and then this small figure stepped out. A girl, no older than 8 maybe. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, and her eyes wide and scared, locked right onto mine. "Please," she whispered, voice barely there. "It's going to get me." I took another step towards her, lowering my flashlight. "You're safe now," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'll get you out of here." Her lips trembled, and for a split second, I thought she was going to start crying again. But then, her face twisted into something else. This cruel, inhuman grin that stretched way too wide. Her eyes went black, and her voice dropped, turning into this guttural growl. "You shouldn't have stopped." And then it lunged, movements all jerky and unnatural. I stumbled back, barely managed to raise my rifle. The creature didn't scream, but the forest did. This deafening, messed up cacophony of distorted cries and howls just erupted all around us, echoing through the trees. My flashlight went crazy, flickering, casting these wild, erratic shadows that seemed to twist and move on their own. I fired a shot. The crack of the rifle cut through the noise for a second, but it didn't stop the creature. It flinched, that grin faltering for a moment, but it kept coming. I turned and ran, sprinting down the trail as the sound of its uneven footsteps followed right behind me. The green glow of the forest got even brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat, and the air turned colder with every step. I finally reached a marked tree, just threw myself against it, chest heaving. The forest went silent again. I didn't dare move. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the rifle. Eyes locked on the trail ahead. Then, the creature appeared at the edge of the trail, body all twisted and twitching. It just stared at me with those black, empty eyes, head tilted like it was waiting for something. The symbols carved into the tree started to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, casting these weird patterns across the ground. The creature hissed, that grin twisting into a snarl, and then it just turned and disappeared back into the darkness. The forest stayed silent for a long time after that. I didn't tell my supervisor about what happened that night. What was I supposed to say? That I almost got killed because I broke the rules, because I was too weak to ignore the sound of a crying kid. The laminated rule card in my pocket felt heavier now, a constant reminder of my screw-up. The fourth night was even colder than the others. And that green glow in the forest, it seemed brighter, more alive. The air itself was buzzing with static, and I swear I could feel eyes on me everywhere I went, even when I couldn't see anything. I stayed clear of the northern ridge, just like the rules said. But that hum that always seemed to come from that direction, it was louder tonight, almost like it was calling to me. That laminated rule card was starting to get worn out, the edges frayed. The ink was smudged from me pulling it out and rereading it a million times, like maybe it would suddenly reveal some hidden secret. Rule 4 had been stuck in my head all day. Avoid the northern ridge after dark. Something watches from the tree line, and it doesn't like to be seen. But what about during the day? I'd spent my first few shifts just avoiding the ridge altogether, keeping my distance from that looming presence. But after my run, in with the crying kid, or whatever that was, I started feeling like the rules weren't just there to protect me, like they were deliberately keeping something hidden, and the ridge was calling to me, in a way the rest of the forest just didn't. The air felt heavier near it, the hum deeper, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I told myself it was just curiosity that was pulling me towards the ridge as day 4 dawned. But deep down, maybe it was defiance. By midday, the ridge was right in front of me. The trees up here were different, no doubt about it. Taller, blacker, like they'd been scorched by fire. Their branches clawed at the sky, all gnarled and twisted. The ground under my boots felt soft, like it had been churned up recently, and patches of moss glowed faintly even in the daylight. The air got colder as I climbed, that hum growing louder with every step. When I finally reached the top, I stopped, just scanned the tree line. The forest stretched out below me, endless, a sea of dark green and black. But something about the ridge itself felt off. The trees here stood unnaturally still, their leaves not moving at all. Even though there was a breeze, shadows clung to their bases, darker and deeper than they should have been in broad daylight. Right in the center of the ridge was a clearing, empty, except for this circle of stones arranged in a pattern I didn't recognize. I stepped closer. As I got nearer to the stones, I noticed something really weird. The shadows cast by the rocks, they didn't match the rocks' shapes. They were long and sharp, forming these jagged patterns that seemed to move even though the stones themselves were still. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. Just at the edge of my hearing, too soft to make out any words. It was coming from the tree line, weaving through that constant, like a thread pulling at my thoughts. "Hello," I called out, instantly regretting it. My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the stillness. The whisper stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. The whole forest seemed to hold its breath. And I felt it again, that weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. It wasn't human. This thing was tall, impossibly thin, its body wrapped in what looked like layers of shadows that just shifted and flickered like smoke. Its head was tilted at this crazy angle. And even though it didn't have a face, I could feel it watching me. I froze, breath caught in my throat. My rifle suddenly felt useless in my hands. The figure stepped forward, movement slow, deliberate. It didn't walk, exactly, more like glided. Its feet never seemed to touch the ground. I backed away, but my foot caught on one of the stones, and I stumbled right into the center of the circle. The air around me changed instantly. That faint green glow of the forest turned into this deep, pulsing red. The figure stopped at the edge of the circle, body twisting and contorting like it was testing some kind of boundary. And then the whispers came back, louder now, overlapping voices that spoke words I couldn't understand. They just poured into my mind, each one like a needle driving deeper into my skull. The figure raised one long, shadowy arm and pointed right at me. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering. The whispers got louder, more insistent, and the shadows at the edge of the circle started to move, creeping towards me like they were alive. I just ran. Man, I ran. Didn't even know where I was going, just away. The hum followed me, growing fainter with every step. But the whispers, they didn't stop. They clung to me, echoing in my mind like a broken record. When I finally reached the base of the ridge, I just collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. The forest around me was quiet again, but the air still felt heavy, charged with static. I pulled out that laminated card, hands still shaking. The rules just stared back at me, stark and unyielding. Rule 4: avoid the northern ridge after dark. Something watches from the tree line, and it doesn't like to be seen. I'd broken the rule during the day, and it had still found me. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go back into the forest. I stayed locked in the ranger station, watching the tree line from the safety of the window. But the forest, it didn't forget. Around midnight, the lights in the station flickered, and the air turned ice cold. The whispers came back, faint at first, then louder, rising to this deafening crescendo. When I looked outside, I saw them, shadows moving between the trees, their shapes all twisted and wrong. They didn't step onto the trail, but they didn't need to. They were just waiting for me to break another rule. The whispers didn't stop, not even after the shadows vanished from the tree line and the lights in the station flickered back to normal. They just lingered, these soft, overlapping voices, scratching at the edges of my thoughts. During the day, they were faint, just low enough to make me wonder if I was imagining them. But at night, they got louder, impossible to ignore. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure from the ridge, elongated limbs, faceless head tilted, like it was just waiting for me to come back. The weight of its gaze, it followed me everywhere, even in broad daylight. And the forest, it didn't feel the same anymore. The hum was different now, sharper, angrier. That green glow that seeped through the grates at night, it pulsed faster, rhythm all uneven, like a heart that couldn't settle down. Even the marked trees, the ones I used to find some comfort in, now seemed to loom over me, their carved symbols twisting into shapes I didn't recognize. It happened 3 nights after I broke Rule 4. I was patrolling the southern trail near the lake when the whispers came back, louder than ever. They weren't faint anymore. They were inside my head, burrowing into my thoughts like insects. You shouldn't have gone there. The words weren't clear at first, buried in the mess of voices, but as I walked, they started to take shape, repeating over and over until they drowned out everything else. You shouldn't have gone there. I froze in the middle of the trail, gripping my rifle so tight my knuckles went white. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting all erratically through the darkness. The forest around me was silent, eerily so. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. For a second, everything seemed normal. Then I saw it, a shadow, long and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the trail. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew it was watching me. Stay back, I whispered, voice trembling. The shadow tilted its head. That same slow, deliberate movement. My flashlight flickered again, and in that split second of darkness, it was gone. The next morning, I noticed something strange. I was in the ranger station bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, when I caught a glimpse of my reflection. At first, I thought it was just the shadows under my eyes, dark circles from too many sleepless nights. But when I looked closer, I saw it, a faint black mark, just above my collarbone. It wasn't a bruise, wasn't dirt. The mark was sharp and angular, just like the carvings on the trees. I scrubbed at it, furious, but it didn't budge. Didn't even hurt. If anything, it felt cold, like it wasn't even part of me. The whispers came back that night, louder than ever. The following night, I just gave up on the trails completely. I stayed locked in the ranger station, clutching my rifle, like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality, watching the tree line through the window. The shadows returned just after midnight. They moved slowly, gliding between the trees with that same unnatural grace as the figure on the ridge. There were more of them now, dozens, maybe more. And they were getting closer. The whispers scratched at my mind, growing louder with every passing minute. My head throbbed, vision blurring as the voices overlapped, repeating the same phrase over and over. You broke the rules. You broke the rules. You broke the rules. The shadows stopped just beyond the edge of the clearing around the station. For a moment, everything went still. Then, one by one, the lights in the station began to flicker. The temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in the air as I backed into a corner. Gripping the rifle so tight my hands ached, the whisper stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. And then I saw it. The shadow from the ridge. It stood in the center of the clearing, taller and darker than the others, its faceless head tilted towards the station. The shadows around it seemed to ripple and bend towards it, like they were drawn to its presence. It raised one long, jagged arm and pointed right at the window. The glass began to crack, thin fractures spreading outward like spiderwebs. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed the laminated rules card from the desk and ran, bursting out the back door and into the forest. The forest was alive. The hum was deafening, vibrating through my bones with every step. The green glow pulsed erratically, casting twisted shadows that danced across the trees. The whispers returned, screaming in my head like 1,000 voices all shouting at once. Behind me, the shadows followed. I could hear them moving through the trees, their distorted shapes flickering at the edges of my vision. The figure from the ridge loomed just behind them. Elongated limbs stretched out unnaturally as it glided closer. I ran blindly, lungs burning, legs threatening to give out. The rules card was clenched tight in my fist, the edges cutting into my palm. I didn't stop until I reached one of the marked trees. The tree's carvings glowed faintly as I collapsed at its base, pressing my back against the trunk. The shadows stopped just beyond the tree's glow, writhing and shifting, as though they were held back by some invisible barrier. The figure from the ridge stood among them, head tilted in that unnatural way. The whispers stopped, and the hum faded into silence. The figure raised its arm again, pointing directly at me. For a moment, I thought it would step closer. But then, it lowered its arm, and the shadows began to retreat, melting back into the forest. The figure was the last to leave. It lingered at the edge of the tree glow, head tilting one final time before it disappeared into the darkness. When I finally made it back to the station, the black mark on my collarbone had spread. It now stretched across my chest in jagged, angular lines, pulsing faintly with a cold green light. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain: the forest hadn't forgiven me. And it never would. The mark was cold, like frost had seeped into my skin. It stretched across my chest in jagged, unnatural patterns, pulsing faintly with that sickly green light. No amount of scrubbing could remove it. I tried water, soap, even a knife in a moment of desperation, but the lines remained, unyielding and unchanging. At first, it seemed harmless, didn't hurt, didn't itch or sting, but I could feel it growing. Not just across my body, but inside me. I started waking up in strange places, far from the ranger station, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My thoughts were harder to hold on to, like they were slipping through my fingers. The forest was in my dreams, now twisting trees, glowing lights, and that figure from the ridge, always watching. The whispers followed me into sleep, weaving through my mind like vines, choking out any peace I might have found. The forest itself became stranger after the mark appeared. The trails I'd walked 100 times didn't lead where they should. I'd turn a corner expecting the lake and find the ridge instead. The trees seemed to move when I wasn't looking, their gnarled branches bending and twisting into shapes that resembled faces. The animals weren't the same either. The deer's antlers spiraled more sharply, and their glowing eyes lingered on me longer than before. Birds perched silently on branches, heads cocked at unnatural angles, watching. The rules, they still worked, for now. But they felt thinner, like a thread stretched to its breaking point. I wasn't sure how much longer they would protect me. One morning, my supervisor arrived unannounced at the station. His face was pale, eyes hard. He looked at the mark on my chest without asking and nodded grimly, like he'd seen it all before. "You've been touched by the forest," he said, voice flat, devoid of any sympathy. "It happens to those who break the rules." "What does it mean?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a fresh laminated card and slid it across the desk towards me. The rules were the same, all 8 of them, but at the bottom, a new line had been added: Rule 9, the marked "Do not leave." I stared at the words, stomach turning. "Hate what happens if I leave?" I asked. He gave me this long, measured look. "You won't make it past the tree line." The mark grew worse as the days passed. The green light pulsed brighter, and I started hearing the hum of the forest, even when I wasn't inside it. It followed me into the station, into my thoughts. One night, I woke up standing in the clearing on the ridge, the circle of stones glowing faintly beneath my feet. I didn't remember walking there. My flashlight and rifle were gone, left behind at the station. The figure from the ridge was there, waiting just beyond the tree line. "You're part of it now," it whispered, voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "You belong to us." I ran, but the forest didn't let me go. Every path led me back to the ridge, the stones brighter with each return. The shadows followed me closer now, their shapes flickering at the edges of my vision, even during the day. The animals watched me with glowing eyes, their movements eerily synchronized, like they were part of something larger. On my final night in the forest, the whispers were deafening, the hum a roar, the green glow pulsing like a heartbeat. The laminated rules card sat on the desk in front of me, edges frayed from use. The words blurred and shifted, and for the first time, I saw them for what they really were: warnings, not just for survival, but to keep something contained. The mark on my chest burned cold, spreading across my arms and neck like vines. I could feel it pulling me, dragging me towards the ridge, towards the stones. I fought it for hours, clutching my rifle like it might anchor me. But my body wasn't mine anymore. At midnight, I stepped out of the station. The forest was alive with light, green, pulsating, unnatural. Shadows twisted and danced, their shapes forming a path that led straight to the ridge. The figure was waiting in the clearing, its form larger now, more defined. The tendrils of its shadow reached out to me as I stepped into the circle of stones. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the stones began to glow brighter, and the hum grew louder, resonating through my bones. The figure tilted its head, and the mark on my chest flared with cold, searing light. My vision blurred as the ground beneath me cracked and split, a green rift opening where the stones had been. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the forest itself, bending toward the rift, its trees twisting and reaching, as though they were feeding it. I woke up in the forest, but it wasn't the same forest I knew. The trees were darker, the sky a deep, endless green. The trails were gone, replaced by winding paths that shifted as I walked. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. I looked down and saw the mark, now covering my entire body, glowing faintly in the dark. In the distance, I saw lights flickering between the trees, not fireflies, but shadows that glided through the forest like living things. I wasn't a ranger anymore. I was one of them. And the forest wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a living, breathing entity that had claimed me as its own. Now I wander its paths, watching and waiting, just as the shadows had watched me. When the next ranger arrives, I'll be there, standing at the edge of the tree line, waiting for them to break the rules. Because the forester, it never lets you leave.